Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me all through the auditorium? I have no sense of this at all. Thanks, Mark, for that kind introduction. And I'm glad that all of you could make it out on a blustery day that threatens to turn even worse. But let's put that out of our minds now. We have more serious things to talk about. We've got the phylloxera. As you can see from this first slide, the late 19th century Europeans took the business pretty seriously. A skeleton tearing away at the precious grape. And the grape was precious to Europe, as I'll touch on as we move on. Now, the phylloxera was very much like a whole series of events that we have seen in our own lives about colliding ecosystems and the movement of diseases from one region of the world or animals from one region of the world to another one. We all know, for example, about Dutch elm disease. I remember as a young boy in Brantford walking down Chatham Street, a gigantic arcade of elms overarching, providing shade. And then in a matter of a week, it was gone. Dutch elm disease. And the carp in the rivers of the United States, lampreys, and zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. The phylloxera fits into that kind of scenario. But in fact, from the viewpoint of human beings, from human society, it had a much, much greater impact. It was far-reaching in character. The phylloxera is not just about wine. It's a story about certain aspects of the economy, about business, about science, and about human institutions and organization. It was an outcome of and a contributor to the processes of globalization in the late 19th century. I'll touch on some of those aspects indeed as we move along. And of an ongoing shift in agriculture in which human intervention becomes a crucial component of plant life. We feed ourselves with things that cannot grow without our assistance. Corn, turkeys, the turkeys we have, many of us at least, at Thanksgiving and at Christmas, cannot reproduce. The chests on the toms are so big, all that lovely breast meat, they can't get at the hens. So maybe that's why they have high blood pressure, I don't know. Yeah. And the phylloxera was also part of an international agricultural crisis in the late 19th century. And the response to the phylloxera saw the development in France and internationally of what we call big science, the blend of private scientific endeavor, of the academic world, and of government support for those, incentivization in effect through funding, support of that science. And the aftermath of the phylloxera also saw the development of institutions and organizations which resonate even today over wine and other agricultural products. And the phylloxera also encouraged the development of big business in wine. So there's a lot of ramifications to this. Now, The modern grapevine for making wine is the product of a great deal of human intervention. It goes back to Neolithic times, the Neolithic Revolution, which saw human beings shift from being hunter-gatherers to living in settlements of various sorts, required stable agricultural production of one sort or another. And the grape was very closely linked to that. It's likely that the grape was domesticated 7,000, perhaps even 8,000 years ago in a wide swath, probably in a wide swath, sweeping from Turkey through Georgia and down into the western part of Iran. And the Neolithic farmers did some very important things for us. First of all, the wild grape required male and female plants. The grapevine, which is genetically very malleable, that the Neolithic farmers pursued, was selected out to be hermaphroditic. So you don't need male and female plants, just one plant. It's self-pollinating. So that was a huge achievement on these fronts. And as well, the genetic malleability of the grapevine allowed for the development of a wide array of cultivars of grape types. It's estimated, we don't know for sure, that there are about 10,000 different types of grapes and grapevines in the world. I'm a pacer, I can't help it. We're constantly discovering new ones and old ones that we thought had disappeared. So there's a huge array of these sorts of things available to us. All of these cultivars, with a few exceptions which I'm going to mention, all of these cultivars of the Vitis vinifera, okay, these are two words you should put in your memory because it's going to redound to your benefit in all the sophisticated discussions about wine that you're going to have. So repeat after me, Vitis vinifera. Good. Oh, that's very good. Some of you must know the words already. Yeah. All of the cultivars of the Vitis vinifera, the wild version is called Vitis vinifera sylvestris, by the way. Not that you need to know the sylvestris tag. Vitis vinifera, all of the cultivars, the 10,000 of them, are all vulnerable to the phylloxera, all of them. And that's what made the disease, the pest so dangerous. Now, if the phylloxera had not been held at bay, this is what we'd be drinking. Perhaps some of you have drunk them. Catawba, Canadian sherry. Mazel Tov, a lovely wine, which I enjoyed illegally in my callow youth. Bright's Concord. Turner Old Sailor. Yes, indeed, Old Sailor. From my memory, the Old Sailor didn't look quite so sprightly. Yeah. So how many of you, raise your hands, how many of you have drunk some of these wines? Yeah, come on. Be honest. Yes, indeed. And that's what we'd be drinking today, the French included, all right? If the phylloxera had not been held at bay. So the pest, the aphid, the devastator, Phylloxera vastatrix, imported from North America to Europe in the last half of the 19th century, came close to wiping out all the grape varieties that we currently enjoy. Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Gewürztraminer, Riesling, Pinot Noir, Malbec, Carmenere, the whole lot would not be here with us. If we had not had an appropriate scientific and practical response which held the pest at bay. You have to keep in mind, the grape is the single most valuable horticultural product in the modern world. Yes, the single most valuable horticultural product in the world today. And almost all, a very large proportion of it, other than table grapes and things of that character, is made into wine. We do enjoy our pleasures and are willing to pay a lot for them. If we take a look at the world of wine 150 years ago, approximately when we start with this talk, we see that that world is mostly centered on Europe. Even today, Europe produces the vast proportion of wine in the world. I won't talk about the isotherms and things like that. That's another talk entirely. And I'm going to give you a bunch of statistics now to show you how important wine is, all right? So for those of you who don't like numbers, turn off. So, and indeed, and I'm going to talk about France in particular because France is the most important scene for wine in the late 19th century. It continues to be of enormous importance in the wine world today. But wine consumption was expanding rapidly in Europe in the late 19th century because a middle class was growing fairly rapidly. And wine, for historical reasons and for reasons that I won't talk about at any length right now, is the favored tipple of people who are moving up in social class. As well, of course, a lot of Frenchmen just drank wine because it was there for them. I'll mention some of the important reasons for that later on. French wine consumption per capita doubled between 1880 and 1910, when the population only grew by about 10%. So you can see that the French were getting into it in a big way. They got into it in an even bigger way during the First World War when the French soldiers had a regular daily wine ration, and so thus came back with a yen for wine. And indeed, the average French wine consumption in the late 19th century came up to about half to two-thirds of a bottle of wine a day. That was adult consumption. Now I'm sure a few of you can outpace that, but I wouldn't encourage it. Secondly, and French exports were enormous at the time. I mean, you can see that from this particular chart here. These are exports from France to the world at large in 1864. You see a lot of it going to Argentina because Argentina was at that point in the late 19th century breaking through to being a developed country. It has regressed badly in the more recent past, but you can see where the French wine was going. This is a map by a very famous French map maker, a fellow by the name of Minard, whose map of French troops during the Napoleonic era, marching into Russia, is very famous. Perhaps some of you have seen it. But the consumption of wine is where I'm going. Is what I'm getting at here. The consumption of wine was increasing. France, Italy, and Spain accounted for about 85% of world production of wine in the latter part of the 20th century. And France itself accounted for half of total world production in its best years. So France was crucial to the world of wine. At its best in 1875, which was the year that France produced more wine than it ever has since or ever did before, they produced 1.8 billion gallons of wine. Or, for those of you who think purely in modern terms, about 70 million hectoliters. Anybody know what a hectoliter is? Okay. And that was just at the point the phylloxera was spreading in France. Okay, that's when it reached its peak. From there, French wine production fell by about 20%. 20%, you can see, to the late 1880s. See here? 550,000, as opposed to 1877, 1.23 million. An enormous drop of wine production. Okay, now before we get into the meat of this matter, let me ask you to learn the other word that you all must know when you talk about wine, in these terms at least: phylloxera. Phylloxera. Yeah, good. Get that firmly in mind. Toss it off when everybody is talking about what a great wine you're having. You can say, you would not be drinking this if phylloxera had won. Yes, indeed. If phylloxera had won. The phylloxera was, in fact, a complete shock to, and this is just another chart showing the same drop in production here. See this enormous slide here? That was the impact of phylloxera production in the impact of the phylloxera on French wine production. And I just thought I'd stick that in. So in any case, the phylloxera came as a complete shock to Europe. Though it was known to exist in I'll get to this in a moment. It was known to exist in North America for a long, long time before. It wasn't identified as such because the North American grapevines had a significant degree of resistance to the pest. But it was quickly identified in Europe as being American because all bad things came from America. This was a precursor, the oidium. These grapes look okay, generally speaking, but they look a little powdery on the outside. That's the oidium. It's a mildew, which destroys the grape. That had been imported from North America in the mid-1840s and had caused a significant crisis in the European wine industry at that time until they discovered they could use sulfur to kill it off. But when the phylloxera came, it was like a repeated alien invasion and consequently people assumed that it came from North America. Part of the confusion that ended up existing about the phylloxera was because it's tiny, not really observable to the naked eye. You see here? That's a match head. And those little yellow spots are the phylloxera. This is a highly magnified bit of rootlet from a vine, and you can see the infestation on the root. And it was underground, so people don't look for things underground by and large as being the problem. And part of the confusion arose because, and there's a second part of it, which I'll talk about too. And this is the part of the pest which exists on the leaf, right? 19th century etching and a photograph of the phylloxera as it exists. This part here is constantly infecting leaves all over the place, and you have to use insecticides to keep it under control. But you cannot use insecticides effectively, as it turns out, on the root version of it. So it's very small, you couldn't see it, and it was underground, all right? So while the first part of the infestation arrived in France probably about 1862, no one complained about it for 4 years. We can see why, in part, by taking a brief look at the dual life cycle of the phylloxera. Part of it is underground, and underground, the reproductive cycle is asexual. They just reproduce underground, infest the roots. Every now and then, a crawler comes up to the surface, develops wings, and moves on to other plants. There's a sexual reproduction on the plant itself, separate from the reproductive cycle below, and then occasionally mites are produced that move back down into the root system. That's very, very complex, one of the most complex insect reproductive cycles that's known, apparently. I'm not an entomologist, so I can't assert this authoritatively, but it is very complex. And then, of course, part of the difficulty was, there's the phylloxera. That's the mite under a powerful microscope. Does look like an alien, doesn't it? One's worst dreams. Part of the difficulty was that it was difficult to identify. And part of it was that the theories, the scientific theories that dominated at this time was that the soil conditions, environmental conditions, were widely assumed by French scientists to be the cause of weakness. Not just for this, but for everybody. If you were getting ill, it was because there's some fundamental imbalance in your system. That allowed disease to strike. So diseases and the phylloxera, even after they identified the mite, were viewed as symptoms of the problem, not as the cause. So there's a big fight about this in French scientific circles. Now, and here you can see what the visual impact is. And you can see that as a vigneron, as a French person owning a bit of vineyard, if he saw this, he'd think there's some kind of minor problem going on with the soil there. Maybe too much water, maybe a bad soil or something like that. And they wouldn't think that it was a pest of the root that was involved. It's probable that the phylloxera didn't get to Europe until the 1860s because of the processes of globalization. By the 1860s, you had steam-driven vessels that could cross the ocean in fairly short order, and the mite could live through that time period. And that's likely how it emerged. And you see the same process taking place in France and in Europe more generally, a kind of integration, economic integration of the country. This is the system of rails in France that developed between 1842 and 1860. By 1860, the place had been unified. The biggest drinkers of Bordeaux's region is down here. The biggest drinkers of Bordeaux's in the world until the development of the French railway system were the English, because it was a lot cheaper to ship from the Bordeaux region up into England, which sits up there someplace, than it was to ship inside France itself. So the development of the railways really unleashed the Parisian market, a growing urban market, a growing middle class, and insatiable wine drinkers. So that kind of marketing meant that, particularly in the south here, in the Midi, in Languedoc-Roussillon, and in Provence, the production of grapes shot up. They were feeding cheap wine to the big Parisian market. The spread of the phylloxera northward from this region is what's of interest. You see, those are two of the provinces. Provence isn't on that one. Here you can see the impact of the phylloxera as it spread. Originally, it was just down here, and then it spread northwards until by the 1890s it had infected all French wine growing areas. "25 years. And boy, the French were lucky it didn't spread faster than that, because it took a long time to develop an effective response to the development of the phylloxera. Here you can see on a map of Europe, it's spread. Some of these dates are incorrect. 1871 is too late for Portugal. 1866 is when it was first reported in the south of France. So, and the British thing, it's anomalous. The Brits didn't grow too many grapes. Some botanist at Kew Gardens, some of you may have visited Kew Gardens, a botanist there discovered something was going on back in 1863. He didn't report it very widely. So the scientific response had time to develop, and it was crucial to defeating the plague. Although one can be forgiven for wondering if the scientific effort could not have been sped up in some fashion or other. And it's interesting that the scientific, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the scientific side of things, so I hope you don't get bored by that component of it. It's interesting because there was considerable controversy about what was actually going on. this had at least two different phases. And then secondly, it's kind of interesting because it saw a significant amount of international cooperation among scientists. And then thirdly, it saw the emergence of big science, as I said before, the cooperation of the private sector, of the government and of universities in pursuit of a common end. So 1862 is probably the time period when it first reached the south of France. And there were public complaints about it starting in 1866. In 1868, a university professor at Montpellier, a professor of pharmacy, Jules-Émile Planchon, here on your left, was called into action, and he and his amateur, he and his amateur brother, amateur entomologist brother-in-law, Jules Lichtenstein, discovered the bug on the root, which they viewed through a loop, you know, the kind of thing that jewelers use. When they discovered it, they showed everybody in the vineyard, including the workers, it was viewed as being a terrific discovery. Unfortunately, in some ways, Planchon, who was a well-known individual, was not an entomologist. He was not a chemist. And as a consequence, in Paris at Science Central, where the big organizations like the Académie des Sciences existed, rather derided, scoffed at the notion that these little bugs were killing off the plants in the south of France. In the long run, he was proven right. So you can see this statue of him in Montpellier, and here a detail of Vigneron reaching up a bunch of grapes to the bust at the top. There are two other busts, at least two other busts of him in Montpellier. I don't know if there are others elsewhere in the country. I wouldn't be surprised if there are. He was a crucial figure in dealing with this issue. But there was a lot of controversy. You'll recall I talked briefly about the two different streams of thought on this. Planchon, Lichtenstein were convinced that the bug was the cause of the problem. In Science Central in Paris, the leading entomologist in France, Victor Signoret, said, no, there's problems with the plant. The bug is just a symptomatic expression of underlying difficulties. So there's a lot of controversy involved in this. Fortunately for Planchon, he very quickly got an ally, the state entomologist of Missouri, later he became the chief entomologist in the United States, Charles Riley, who made a kind of intellectual leap. He thought that perhaps this bug on the root of the French vines was exactly the same bug that you saw on the leaves of vines in North America. And from there, it was not such a great intellectual leap to think that somehow American vines were resistant to the bug, to the phylloxera. So there was a huge and vigorous debate in France about the causes of these things. Planchon, Lichtenstein, And Riley actually had an extensive correspondence back and forth. Riley wrote to Planchon and suggested what was going on. Planchon seized on this as a possibility. Riley visited France in 1871 and hung out with Planchon, Liechtenstein, and a group of scientists at Montpellier who were advocates of the bug theory. And in turn, Planchon and Liechtenstein visited the United States to see the vines there, to see what was going on. And they discovered in due course that there were some Native American vines that had the aphid on them. So by the early 1870s, it was known that it was the same thing. The same thing. And probably the route that the phylloxera took to France was via French vine growers had imported American vines into France to allow for some experimentation. Against oidium, for example, the American vines had considerable resistance towards oidium. There's a further difficulty, and that is that French vignerons, which covered an enormous spectrum from people who owned a hectare or two to people who owned 20, 30, 40 hectares, there was a lot of resistance to changing traditional methods of growing grapes. That resistance was expressed because they loved their vines. They loved the grapes that grew on them. They were French, right? And for Frenchmen, all things French are the best, right? Getting that mixed up with those newfangled other types of things, no, that wasn't for them. They were traditionalists. They'd learned their skills from their forebears, from their neighbors. They weren't going to change them. Many of the French vignerons thought that the problem of the phylloxera was because those new guys down in the south of France getting involved in growing vines didn't know what they were doing. They didn't respect the vine. They didn't grow it properly. They, on the other hand, the folk further north, knew all about it. They didn't have to worry about these things. And they didn't like things American, particularly. America had brought them oidium and things of that character. Wine was part of the French identity. Yeah. And thus, the thrust was to protect what existed rather than move on to the new. That was quite a thing. By 1874, pretty much the full cycle and various types of the oidium, of the phylloxera were known. The illustration on your left is actually from an article written by Riley, and it's probably his own personal drawings. He was a very good drawer of insects. And here on your right, you see the French version of this. So what were the solutions that were offered at the time? One was through law. The importation of American vines was prohibited. There were a lot of them already in the south of France, and then as well, the movement of those vines inside France was prohibited. You couldn't get rid of them in the south of France, but you could prevent them from moving elsewhere. And that gave the French a bit more time to develop responses. One response that was discovered entirely by accident was that if you flooded your vineyards for about 40 days in the middle of winter, it killed off the bug. You deprived them of oxygen. So flooding was a possibility. But you can't flood a lot of vineyards. There's plenty of vineyards that can't be effectively flooded. And soil types are often very, very different and very permeable. That would mean that you had to pump water on the vines on an ongoing basis, requiring steam engines and the expenditure of a great deal of money, which a lot of the vignerons did not have. The second component was chemical application. They discovered carbon bisulfides could kill the pest off. The difficulty with carbon bisulfides is that this very, very powerful and noxious chemical, toxic really, was extremely dangerous for the plants as a whole and for every living organism in the soil. You applied too much, you killed everything, including the vines. So that didn't serve very well. You applied too little, you didn't kill off the phylloxera. So you had to have highly skilled people do this kind of work. This is an applicator in a museum devoted to such things, and here's a contemporary illustration of the application of carbon bisulfide to the roots of the plant. Also an extremely expensive proposition. More than just expensive, both the flooding and the chemicals had to be applied every year. So it was an ongoing operating expense. It wasn't a one-time solution. And that was the really terrifying part from a cost perspective. And there was an organizational response, and this is particularly of importance from a long-term perspective. Extensive organization was required. The French government, first of all, undertook to pursue some of the solutions to these things by providing basically the equivalent of a block grant to the Académie des Sciences. The Académie, in turn, set up a central committee which drew in experts from a variety of different areas, including a lot of chemists, as it happened, which is why this sort of solution was being pursued. But the organizational effort went far beyond that to local organizations. Every département, the equivalent of a county in France, had its own little organization where these things were debated, where educational efforts were pursued, where the considerable subsidies that were provided by the French government for purposes of chemical application in particular could be distributed, through which they could be distributed. By the late 1880s, in France, the various levels of organization largely focused on the phylloxera numbered about 7,000 or more. So there was a big, big, widespread response because livelihoods were being threatened. So it was here that the rubber hit the road. And you saw here a kind of collective response too. Jules-Émile Planchon belonged to several local organizations and focused in on this particular difficulty. A very active man, very active. The local organizations published pamphlets for distribution to the vignerons. They provided educational facilities. they distributed, as I mentioned, funding from the central government. And so even while chemicals are being heavily used still in the late 19th century, in the South, where Planchon and his allies had considerable strength, experimentation, desperate experimentation, was taking place with American vines. Unfortunately, it was discovered that not all American vines were fully resistant to the phylloxera. It was dependent, they discovered, on the kind of soil. Certain kinds of soil, many of the American vines didn't have significant resistance at all. In other types of soil, they had tremendous resistance. So terroir made a difference here. But a way was found. Through the careful experimentation in Bordeaux, a man by the name of Pierre-Marie Millardet discovered that if you hybridized French vines with American wild vines, you could get rootstocks and plants that had considerable resistance to the bug. Some of the hybrids produced some decent wine. Have any of you drunk Marechal Foch, for example? Quite possibly. That's a hybrid. So that was one solution. Genetic blends between American and European vines. But the real solution, which Millardet proposed and which others seized upon very happily, including Planchon, was grafting. Grafting European grape varieties onto hybridized American rootstock. Oh, by the way, here's an illustration of Riley, and in the background, Planchon and Liechtenstein in France. They're tearing out vines and examining for the phylloxera. And here, likewise, in Burgundy, they're tearing out the vines, which had to be done. And that was one of the chief problems, of course, with the whole grafting issue. You had to rip out the entire vineyard. You probably had to leave it fallow for a year. Then you had to plant the hybridized roots, plants, and then you had to graft. A complex, long, ongoing thing. This agricultural associations. This chap here in the center was of some importance because he actually, as a reformer, brought in legislation to encourage organization in France of the syndicat and the like. He died young of overwork, so it goes to say. But grafting too had its problems. These are the variety of soils that you can run across in France, so you can see there's quite a wide variety of different soil types. Here, a photograph from a place that I visited in Europe where they showed the different soil types producing the different types of grapes, so you can get a sense of the variety of soils that were available to the vignerons in France and why there might be problems with the rootstock. And here's Pierre-Marie Alexis Millardet, the sharp guy who figured out about hybrids. And here we run across the problem of grafting. It required a lot of skill and a lot of money. As I said, you had to replant the vineyard. Then you had to cut the growing vines off, and you had to develop, you had to use a graft for these purposes. So this is how you, in fact, prepare the graft, the science called, that would be grafted onto the rootstock. And here is a modern photograph taken in California. You see a highly skilled individual inserting the grafts onto the rootstock, and then afterwards the whole thing is bound up and tarred. It requires a lot of skill and a lot of money. The latest phylloxera infestation that has taken place was from a root perspective, took place in California in the 1980s and early 1990s, when through some piece of nastiness, the phylloxera had managed to make a biological change to itself and had been able to attack the hybrid, the A cross R number 1, that was used in a dominant way in California itself. California vineyards were devastated. They had to be entirely replanted. So we know what the modern costs are involved. To replant an acre of vineyard, tear it out, and replant an acre of vineyard is $12,000. The lost production spreading out over 4 or 5 years amounts to another $50,000 or more. This is serious money, and it's not surprising that a lot of French people couldn't afford to do it. And grafting was a serious skill as well. And one of the aspects of the organizations that developed in France was to develop workshops where people could learn how to graft effectively. Planchon was involved in that as well. Let me go on to talk about some of the consequences of the phylloxera. Particularly, we'll start off with social consequences. This gives us some sense of what a disaster it was. Now, why do you think ordinary Frenchmen drank wine? Anybody willing to volunteer a thought? Pardon me? The water wasn't any good, yeah. Yeah, it was a good way to avoid bacteria. You mix a little wine with your water and it cleans up most of the bacteria. That's one reason. The second is something that you probably wouldn't consider at all, and that is that wine was a source of caloric uptake for the general population. Particularly in impoverished rural areas. We have evidence from Calabria and southern Italy that goes to show that in the late 19th century, so it gives you some idea of how poor these places were and how small the physique of the people were. Wine provided 60% of the necessary caloric uptake of an adult. 60%. A bottle of wine contains about 625 calories. 1,500 calories perhaps for a day. The wine was weak, mind you, 4 or 5%, not much stronger than beer. So that could be a really serious problem. If you can't grow your vines, and that provides you with the bulk, a significant portion of your nutrition, you're in a lot of trouble, a lot of trouble. And what happened in France, you can take a look at the data, that in the years where the phylloxera was most dominant, French people in those areas, when they became adults, were shorter. That was the kind of impact it had. There was a secondary impact that should be noted in this kind of context. People who were impoverished didn't have access to credit and didn't have significant capital resources. They lost their livelihoods. What happens to people like that? They go bankrupt. And if they go bankrupt, they have to leave. So what you saw in France was a movement of many people from the rural areas into the cities. And you saw this throughout Europe. In the Dalmatian coast, that's part of Croatia now, where they'd shifted over to a lot of grape monoculture to supply the French market during the period of the early phylloxera. When the phylloxera hit there after 1900, hundreds of thousands of Croatians left. Many of them to the United States, to the Northeast, lots of them to the Chicago area. That was the power of the phylloxera. There were economic consequences of note as well. The demand for wine did not fall in this time period. It continued to rise because in the urban centers you had a middle class that could afford it, or people who aspired to the middle class, who wanted to afford it. And the upshot as a consequence was that the wine was drawn from elsewhere. Production increased very significantly in the outlying areas. In Spain, for example, production shot up quite considerably. In Greece, production moved up a fair bit. The Greeks sent the French cakes of dried out grapes from which they could add water, and the upshot would be they could make wine. Algerian wine production rose very, very sharply. Also in your callow youth, you would have drunk Algerian wine. I remember being up in Ottawa doing my master's, striking across the border and buying gallon jugs of Algerian wine to slake my insatiable thirst. And the Dalmatian area, as I mentioned, also increased grape production a fair bit. So you had an arena for when the French production came back on board, that there would be vast overproduction. And that, in fact, is what occurred. And this brings us back to the associational response to the crisis. Because French peasants, and that's not a word of denigration, French peasants had been traditionally very individualistic and extremely competitive. What had happened with the phylloxera was that they were encouraged to gather in groups, syndicat, or basically farmers' unions, rural organizations of various kinds. They learned to work together collectively to achieve results, and in due course they became politicized. And that gave smaller producers a kind of political power they never had before. When that overproduction hit in the late 19th and early 20th century, combined with practices that were in effect fraudulent, with grape cakes, the importation of Algerian wine, which would be mixed with local wine and then sold as local wine, there was a lot of irritation by the small vignerons who could not afford to do such things. There were riots. The cellars of the larger producers that were suspected of this kind of fraudulent behavior were broken into and destroyed. In 1907, there were enormous protests in the south of France. Hundreds of thousands of small vignerons got together in Montpellier and elsewhere to protest these aspects. And they got results. They got results on a number of fronts. Laws were passed that prohibited this type of fraudulent behavior, including the addition of sugar to fermenting wine to increase the alcohol content. All of that was considered to be fraudulent, and some laws were passed to prevent this by 1910. Those laws were the basis of the AOC, the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée system that dominates in France now. So the making of wine became tightly controlled through law, through common agreement, through government supervision in France. This is a long-term consequence of the phylloxera. So, I'm going to stop now. Wine today is completely dependent on human intervention. We cannot grow, we cannot have the fine wines that we drink today without constant human intervention. With grafting, through chemical usage, through the complex science and technology of processing grapes into wine. That's true of virtually most modern agricultural products, I should point out. We like to think sometimes when we're sitting out, looking over the grass and the woods, having a glass of wine, that we're somehow communing with nature. Right? Just like our ancestors, our distant forebears, thought they were communing with the gods. What we are is communing with science and technology. Sure, there are small boutique wineries that can produce a few thousand cases a year at enormous cost. Not many of us go out and buy bottles of wine that are worth $75 a pop, or for that matter, $1,500 a pop. That's for the wealthy. But we can thank science, we can thank the collective French response to the phylloxera, that we can find good, palatable, and even exquisite wines at moderate price. Thank you.